Hello and welcome back to everyone joining us on another exciting episode of Comply or Die. As usual, I'm your host Kyle, and today I've got with me Charissa, a security TPM at SEMGREP. And if you're looking at that or listening to this and thinking, what is a security TPM? Well, it probably ties quite nicely into our podcast for tonight with the new Gen Z take on SOC 2. So to answer that first question, security TPM, Security Technical Program Manager. And what we're discussing tonight, exactly like I said, the Gen Z take on SOC 2, a fresh take on security. So Charissa, thank you so much for joining us. A quick intro just for our guest that I'd like to make. Obviously, you've been known for modernizing the cybersecurity space, right? Speaking at numerous different conferences and on panels, including things like B-Sides, New York City, Diana Initiative, as well as events that have been hosted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for anyone familiar with that space being NIST. So thank you. Super excited to have you on the podcast. I think to have this modern and fresh sort of take on a framework and a bit of compliance that has been around for ages is really refreshing. Welcome. And is there anything you'd like to add in our introduction?
No, thank you so much for having me. It's honestly such an honor to be here talking to you, and I'm just really excited to be on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Charissa. So for all our listeners joining us today on this podcast, the goal is maybe to have that fresh perspective on SOC 2 and on compliance. So to dive right into the first sort of question that we've got lined up for today, Charissa, talk us through it. When you were first exposed to SOC 2, did it surprise you? What did you sort of take from this framework?
Right. So my break-in through cybersecurity has been sort of like an untraditional start, I'd say. I started my background in cybersecurity ever since high school, and I joined a bunch of cybersecurity competitions, partook in a lot of CTFs, and that was just like when I got my hands-on experience with cybersecurity. And I always knew about the compliance and data privacy aspect, and I was like slightly interested, but I never really got full-on exposure until I had an internship at this startup called SEMGREP, and it opened a lot of perspective in terms of like how data privacy should work, what these compliance frameworks should look like when you apply it to a B2B or even B2C company. And ever since then, I became more interested in SOC 2 and GDPR and just like data privacy in general. And I'd say a lot of people might find it boring, like because auditors are using compliance and it might not seem as fun because you have to follow a bunch of frameworks and those frameworks require different controls and like you have to follow those controls. So obviously rule following might not be as much fun. But ever since I started my internship at that security startup SumGrep, I was just thinking, how can I make this more fun and how can I make this more engaging for people at our company? Because security trainings, it's a really important, especially it's day to day, and there's so many different like security vulnerabilities happening like day to day. And so I was just thinking, I know how. I'm a Gen Zer, right? And I guess what's a Gen Z, right? I would just say it's like typically like anyone who's like young, I guess, felt like who can like sort of there's like a bunch of Gen Z like trends on social media, right? And so as social media is constantly emerging, like TikTok and Instagram and like YouTube, like shorts and reels, all of that, I think they help play a role with these like Gen Z trends. And as someone who is a huge fan of watching some of these TikToks or Instagram reels, I was just thinking, oh, maybe I can take some of these Gen Z trends and apply it to security so I can make it more fun, more approachable for everyone who might find it boring. So this is how I decided. I'll just make SOC 2 and give it like a Gen Z twist. And every single talk or conference where I talked about SOC 2, I sort of spin that Gen Z twist. And I realized that a lot of people became more interested. And so I think that's just the secret hack. All you have to do is just apply things with a Gen Z twist, and people will become more interested regarding data privacy, which SOC 2, for example.
That's super cool, and there's a few points you touched on that I think really makes sense. Like you said, maybe from a Gen Z perspective, following rules isn't so cool, right? It's not as fun, but in security compliance, well, you sort of have to. So the way to maybe get people to go about that for a framework that's existed for a very long time, and I mean, we've obviously seen some of the evolvement applying SOC 2, and we'll definitely discuss some of that now, to modern businesses. I mean, the type of tech, AI driven companies that we're seeing in the space are vastly different from what we were looking at 20, 25 years ago. And like you said, you've got to find the way both to modernize how people make that interesting, but also how it applies to the companies, right? So, I mean, you taking this twist and modernization on it, how did you then practically go about implementing SOC 2, or approaching this as a project, a framework, a Gen Z sort of task?
Okay, so yes, I think modernizing it, especially when you have like a younger set of crowd, such as like the new batch of like software engineers who might not be familiar with like SOC 2 compliance frameworks, I would definitely recommend modernizing it, right? I think the main goal is to sort of take the SOC 2, create a security first culture rather than just forcing companies to just check off a list of requirements. Because when you have that checklist and when you have those like rule sets, people are expected to just follow it. And following rules can sometimes be boring, right? Even though it's really important, it can still be boring. And so the way I sort of try to approach SOC 2 and the way that we try to implement it at the startup that I'm currently at, we wanted to add some like Riz. And I don't know, maybe you've heard the word Riz. It's like the new Gen Z slang for like charisma. And the way that we approached applying more Gen Z aspects is, for example, Gen Z slang is a huge thing. And just like I mentioned with Riz, charisma. Fun fact, this is not security related whatsoever, but my name Charissa is actually like originated from the word charisma. That's how my parents named me. They named me after the word charisma and just replaced the with an S. And that's how I introduce myself anytime everyone just asks me, how do you spell your name? Because my name is sort of like uncommon in terms of the spelling. And when I once said that and once also explained the word Riz, just like explaining it to HR, just like this is how Riz works. Like it's basically a shortened word for charisma. Everyone from my company started to call me Riz, just like as my nickname. So I was just like, man, everyone at the company thinks I'm Riz. And I was just like, maybe I can sort of use that as a way to sort of implement SOC 2 and apply security to our startup. So we created this thing called a RizBot, and it's basically an automated bot that has my profile picture. It has the name RizBot, like RIZZBOT, and what it does is that it sends a reminder to anyone who hasn't completed their security trainings within a certain SLA. And that RizBot is just like an automated message from me with like Gen Z slang and Gen Z vernacular saying, finish your security training, and like different emojis, and just making it super fun, bright, colorful. And I think in that sense, we've noticed that more people started to complete their security trainings a lot quicker. And I think that's just like an example of how we sort of made SOC 2 a little bit more fun. So we just included more like slang and persona within our internal communications is like just one example. Another thing that we did is that we created like actual SOCs. So as you all know, SOC 2 compliance, especially for SOC 2 Type 2, it requires like internal auditing after you've finished a certain observation period within the controls, right? And so we had our audit period. We first had our observation period, and then we had our audit period. And we told everyone in our company, if we become SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, we will provide everyone with SOC 2 Type 2 SOCs. Because the thing with SOC 2 compliance, it requires different overhead from like other departments, such as like you need to coordinate with HR, you need to talk to engineering, you need to talk to infra, you need to talk to different departments so that way you can sort of get an oversight of which controls are working and which controls that you guys are actually implementing. And from that, we wanted everyone from our department to all contribute and all be a part of our SOC 2 auditing process. And by just sort of giving like a benefit saying like we're making like SOC 2 Type 2 SOCs once we become SOC 2 audited, and once we become SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, I think it sort of encourages our like a security friendly culture at our company. And we created like really cute SOC 2 SemGrep socks, and everyone loved them. Everyone still wears them to this day. Like during our SOC 2 auditing period, I just saw a couple people wearing them, and I'm just like, you are SOC 2 socks. But I think like the main goal is to just sort of have an energy and just apply that to SOC 2 and make it somewhat relatable and engaging for anyone. Also, like another thing that we did is that we sort of changed up our security trainings. As everyone knows, security trainings, they can be somewhat boring. I'm not saying that they're boring, but like other people who are not as familiar can consider these security training videos boring. But they're all standard protocol. Like everyone needs to watch security training videos in order to prevent any security problems that they could face internally or externally. And instead of using our security training videos that we received from other companies, I decided to actually produce and create our own security training videos and sort of add like a Gen Z twist so that way people would stay more engaged and actually watch our security training videos because we all know sometimes people will just have that video up while doing something else. I don't know, doing their actual work. And so by doing that, I'd say that it encouraged a lot more people to actually pay attention to what we are talking about during our security training videos, but also make it a lot of fun, especially because we added that Gen Z twist and angle. And I also just think that compliance framework, it's still rooted in a lot of like legacy thinking, which might feel a little bit detached from like fast evolving tech that many of us all are a part of. But when you actually like apply it and add in a bit more energy and a bit more fun, a lot more people will actually start to open up and actually start to accept these like standards and these frameworks and be more accepting of it. And I think that's the trick.
What you definitely nailed with that, and I think for anyone listening to this will be able to relate, in particular with security training, people don't find it valuable, right? It's a bit of a checkbox exercise from a compliance perspective. It's a headache. You want to just click next, get through the quiz, complete it, so it's done. And I've spoken about this on various different podcasts with guests as well. Your people are your biggest weakness in any organization, right? So it's such a valuable control and process to have in place if you can get the buy-in from people. To just sort of click next the whole way through is achieving nothing. So I think if everyone listening to this will agree with that process. If you can make it more relatable, you can make it more valuable. If you can make it more valuable, you can make it more secure, and you're going to build a better business process. So you've modernized it by piquing people's interest, but you're actually getting a lot more value. Look, one thing I will also note, I feel like we come from a different generation, and you're making me feel very old with some of the words you're mentioning, and I feel like we aren't that different, but it's really cool to see that side of things. So I mean, maybe keeping going with this process on the modern day take. I know you've done a lot of different interviews, and one of the things we had discussed offline before was obviously around security policies, SOC 2, where that crossover is, in particular with engineers. So we've obviously discussed the partner, and you've mentioned already all the different departments you need buy-in from for a SOC 2 project. We know how many different tech and IT related controls typically form the basis of your SOC 2 and that system description itself. So maybe what could be quite interesting, what are some of the surprising things you've heard from engineers, sort of from any of these conversations you've had?
Right. So as I was preparing for my conferences and there were a couple of talks where I was just thinking, like, I sort of want to hear from like different departments and sort of ask around what their take is on SOC 2 because I already have my perspective because I work with it almost every day, right? And I sort of wanted like a fresh perspective and wanted to hear from other people. So I went around, no joke, I asked 50 people, 50 engineers actually, to be specific. And I asked around, just asking like, what do you think about SOC 2? Or do you even know what SOC 2? And honestly, I was really surprised by the results because I didn't hear that. I didn't hear a lot of people actually knowing SOC 2 is unless they were higher in their position, like a CISO level. And so a lot of the engineers I asked either happened to be entry level or just maybe their first or second year, which I would also consider they're probably like maybe Gen Z, I'd say. And so these Gen Z or software engineers that I was asking, a lot of them didn't actually know what SOC 2 was. And if they did know a little bit of SOC 2, a lot of them considered just like busy work, just a bunch of boxes that you just like check to make it seem like you're more secure. But I also asked, like, I also asked those exact same engineers, like, how much of the time do you actually read your company's like, security policies? And like, when you first like sign in with like your company, you're given like a bunch of security policies to just like read through and actually sign. And that way you're officially onboarded and hired and you go on with your work. But actually, a lot of people do not read their security policies. Honestly, you could get fired for that. And I'm not saying that I'll tell on them or anything, but like you can get fired. And so that's actually a huge security problem. If people are not reading the security policies that these security compliance people are drafting up, that's terrible. And so I was just like, wow, like there's actually a decent amount of software engineers. And I was pulling these from like different friends from college and just random LinkedIn cold messages. And so there was like a decent variety where a lot of them didn't know what SOC 2 is, or if they knew the framework, they just didn't seem that it was as valuable just because you're like checking off boxes. And a lot of them don't read their security policies. And I think the main takeaway that I realized is that because they're so heavy with like the coding aspect, I don't think they deem it as important. But that's the problem. That's the thing. You're not supposed to see it as like a one and done thing where you finish it as a checkbox. You have to actually implement that culture and create that security drive within the company you're at. The only way I saw by doing that is just adding a more modern touch, just because like a lot of the thinking that SOC 2 has right now, it's very like legacy thinking, right? And so in order to adapt like SOC 2 and just like data privacy to the operations, you can risk like compliance theater. And if it's also not fully integrated like into your day-to-day, um, that just means that you're not really prioritizing security culture and you just have to start applying it sort of like intelligently and more like out of the box.
I think one really big thing from that, like you said, is that understanding the process, right, and the
Right.
impact. I've seen very much the same in the industry as well. It goes back to we've said it a few times now, that checkbox exercise, wanting to get things done. But you're spot on. I mean, your policies are your governing processes in any organization, and you as an employee in whatever department that may be, engineering obviously has a heightened focus because of being directly involved in product development, which is obviously what you are subjecting the scope of your SOC 2 review for. And like you said, there's value from it. If something goes wrong, okay, what are you going to do? Well, if you aren't aware of the policies, you're not aware of the right reporting process. Who should you contact? What's a mitigation plan from it? And there definitely is that aspect where it's helpful. Like we're saying, it's not so much a pain point. There's a policy and it's you have to go through and read it. It's helpful. It's in case something goes wrong, you've got that in place. And like you were mentioning in one of your closings now with it around the legacy controls. I mean, as a basis, yeah, SOC 2's gone through its updates, but maybe, and we're definitely bringing in this into the conversation with sort of one of the next questions I'd like to get into. At its basis, there's no controls in SOC 2, right? We've got governing principles and we've got criteria that are making that up. And for anyone listening that has gone through this process, you're probably really well versed with this already. But the nice side from that, and going back to how we find value and how we modernize it, well, yeah, you might still have a criteria that's talking about independence and oversight and how these sort of functions are carried out, but you're very much able to apply that modernization in, okay, our organization has that in place and we have a process and we have a control that we're doing on a daily basis, but it's very different to what a company 10, 15 years ago were doing. So, I mean, with that, the part that I'd really like to tie into is this unique Gen Z modern valuable view that you've got on SOC 2. What do you find, I suppose the best way to look at it, what has been and can be modernized and what still seems like it's stuck in the past?
Okay, that's like a really great question. And so I think SOC 2 it has the right idea when it comes to like foundational security, right? Because it covers like essential controls like access management, data protection, incident response. And those are all critical for any startup or any business aiming to build customer trust, especially because these customers are trying to see that SOC 2 compliance. And so I think SOC 2's flexibility, it's like perfect for any company like starting out like startups because it just gives you a guideline without like super rigid rules. And it's very helpful as tech is constantly modernizing, constantly changing. Business models also change as well too. And so the focus that SOC 2 brings is building trust. And that's exactly what these customers are looking for. And that's how you riz them up with your SOC 2 compliance. But I think because SOC 2 still has its like legacy thinking, there's like, I think you can sort of see that it lacks of depth in areas like endpoint security or like DevOps integration or like continuous like cloud monitoring. So I'd say most businesses or maybe some tech companies like operate in like remote first or cloud centric environments. SOC 2 sort of seems like that it's like still made for like office networks or like on premise like data centers. And in particular, there's also so many tools that you can implement, such as like API security or dynamic code analysis or like automated like monitoring. But SOC 2 doesn't enforce that. And if anything, you would have to personally enforce that yourself or personally work on those security architects, right? And so I think what could be better or what SOC 2 could be better, which I don't know how likely this would change, is just more guidance on like application level security and just like secure like development practices, I think would help make SOC 2 feel less outdated and more in tune with like current tech developments. But also just like at the end of the day, SOC 2 is still really, really, really great within like that foundational security like general basics, right? And I think that one thing that SOC 2 just does really well is that it just enforces people or just enforces the company to continuously stay on that foundational groundwork. And so it just enforces that like no, it's not like a one-time checkbox that you're doing. It's like an ongoing commitment that you actually have to be a part of, regularly update your security practices, regularly address these vulnerabilities, right? So that way your company can make sure that it maintains a compliant and healthy security posture. And I think by that way, like still making sure that you fully stomp on these like foundational security practices and just like applying more and adding more security development changes will help like any of your company just stay ahead with like evolving threats because there's so many that happen day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look at SOC 2 at its foundation, right, and you mentioned the word trust there, and that it's part of SOC 2. You have your TSCs, your trust service criteria, your trust service principles, depending how you look at it. That's the purpose of it. And if we look at the goal of a SOC 2, I mean, to any sort of company you're explaining, going through it the first time, what is the purpose when you're trying to define controls, when you're trying to define your processes that you want to reflect in your system description? And in this, it's always a case of, well, what would your prospects care about? What do your customers care about? You want them to have trust over their data that's in your environment, trust over the product that they're using on your side. And it works both ways. Well, if you've implemented good security controls, your customers are happy and you also have that reassurance, right?
Right.
And that modernization, like you mentioned, we very much see it. I completely agree with that sentiment where previously maybe typical controls you would have on-premise servers, you would have a lot more infrastructure physically on a customer's premises, whereas now everything's in the cloud. And look, I think that's also something where I personally have seen a bit of a shift and people are better versed and understand their requirements better because, well, the nice thing with all these cloud tools and architectures is, Okay, you need a vulnerability scanning tool. Well, most likely, whatever cloud provider tool you're using, it's just another service. You pay a bit more money, click a button, and it's enabled. You want some sort of monitoring tool. Same thing. There's very few services you can't get at the click of a button. I feel like very Gen Z mentality is this instant gratification. So it very much ties into and helps that side of things. And I think then the one responsibility that customers and people are starting to adopt better is their responsibility. So, like we're saying, you can use so many different services and you've got this accessibility to thousands, but you can't just click a button and hope everything's good. You still need to review what are your responsibilities. And this, I suppose, ties into that shared responsibility model between you as a customer and your service provider that you're making use of. Yeah, it's a very interesting side of things. And that's part of the conversation as well, right? Where we're saying you still have responsibilities as a customer in a very tech-enabled world. You've been part of a very fast-paced SOC 2 journey in a more modernized space. What have you seen are some sort of gaps, or I mean, based in your experience, what are the traps that you should try and avoid?
Right. Okay. So I've actually took a couple of notes during our last year's SOC 2 compliance, and there were some information that I've collected amongst like other people I've asked around within the security field just due to prep for my conference talks. And I think here are some key tips that I've learned. I think one big trap is just mistaking volume for value. I feel like a common misconception is that more policies automatically mean better compliance. But if anything, that just leads to document fatigue. Like I said, I've interviewed like maybe over 50 software engineers, and a good chunk of them don't actually read through the security compliance policies, right? And if you also think about it, no one really would want to spend their own time reading that 50-page policy manual. So the key is you want to have fewer, but like well-tailored policies that actually align with how your team works. When you overwhelm your coworkers or teams with procedures that they can't realistically follow, I'd say it only leads to just gaps and frustration. So KISS, keep it simple, stupid. But we don't call people stupid, so just KIS. Another trap I could think of is a thing called cyberdazzle. And the way I guess the word cyberdazzling would apply to in context of SOC 2 is I'm going to be cyberdazzling an auditor. And this is where like companies will put on a show of complex technical setups without ensuring auditors actually understanding that system. As you all know, like when you get SOC 2 Type 2 audited, there's CPAs that are looking over your controls, and some of them might not have the proper cybersecurity background, and you can basically cyberdazzle auditors. But the key thing that you want to do is actually find a SOC 2 auditor that actually understand your security network and architecture, or else you risk them missing key risks and just having them glossing over vulnerabilities just because they're overwhelmed or underinformed or just unaware. So you wanted to make sure that you have the right auditors. And that is also just through research and word of mouth, and just also finding other companies who might have gotten audited by specific companies. So you just want to avoid cyberdazzling auditors. Also, I think another misconception that I've realized is that, once again, we've discussed this previously, but I just think it's really important that people just see SOC 2 as just like a checkbox. Like, you're not supposed to see it as a single sprint. You have to sort of see it as like a marathon. It's like an ongoing commitment, right? So, any fast growing startup or business needs to build in mechanisms to review and update their security continuously. Changes in tech and new integrations, or even like customer feedback, should feed into that periodic SOC 2 review. And I think when you see SOC 2 as like a check once compliance, like you're one and done, I think companies, any company honestly, will risk losing the real benefit of SOC 2, which is that continuous improvement of their security posture. So those are my three tips. Yeah.
Amazing. And one of the first points we discussed, we sort of summed up into the word value. And what I find so meaningful from what you've said, and for everyone listening, is it's changing that perception from how you see an audit, right? A lot of people, they're fearful of the auditor because we're going to fail our SOC 2. They're going to look for gaps. They're going to find any opportunity. But if we again just go into what the outcome of a SOC 2 attestation is, right? It's an auditor's opinion. It's an auditor issuing to say your controls are good or your controls are not good. So from that side, the point that you said, an auditor, you actually want to understand your environment because they can provide value. They can say, okay, you've tried to implement a control, but your process is actually not suited to your environment because of this, that, or the next thing. And you can then potentially avoid this, I can't believe I'm saying this, cyber dazzling of these auditors, because you've now actually been able to put a valuable control in place and you're taking that recommendation and you obviously tied the part with customers as well. Again, let's go back to who are the readers of your reports. Well, these are your prospects and customers. So
Right.
it all ties into this compliance journey, right? Like you said,
Mm-hmm.
it's an ongoing process. One and done is the worst and it's the biggest headache because a lot of companies aren't yet at that point where they see again the value of it. It's they see the value in terms of, okay, we've got our SOC 2, we can close deals instead of looking at that long-term benefit. Okay, we've got our SOC 2, how can we now make it better and better? And that whole ongoing process. So look, I mean, I think there's so much insight to take away from each and every one of those points. I want to maybe use that as our final one. And in wrapping up today for you, this evening for me, because we're on different sides of the world, leave us, if you can, with your survival guide. What are those last key tips you would recommend to someone listening to this? They're thinking about going through SOC 2. They've maybe now listened to this podcast and they either think it's a whole lot less daunting or they're still just trying to figure out what RIS and cyber dazzling actually means. What are your final words of wisdom to leave them with?
Right. I think the main way of approaching SOC 2, especially with our modern companies and our modern evolving tech, I'd say the number one thing is just make it fun, make it simple. And in terms of making it fun, this is just making sure you apply a security first culture at your company. And because there's like when you look at your new batch hires, most of them tend to be on the younger side. I'd say Gen Z. And the way you can make security more approaching, more fun for these Gen Zers, coming from a Gen Zer myself, I'd say just you'd want to implement sort of like fun Gen Z trends and just modernize security and apply it and just spread it out like that. And I'd say that's how you can sort of make security more approachable and more fun for people who wouldn't care to begin with, because you're adding things that they would actually be interested in, which might be like Gen Z trends. Another thing is, I think what's really important for companies is to just understand your like specific risk landscape. Because SOC 2 gives you a lot of options and a lot of flexibility, it's not as rigid as what most people may think. So you want to make sure that you tailor it to your unique business needs. So you want to identify what matters most, whether it's like customer data privacy, uptime, incident response, and you want to focus on securing those areas first. Um, Compliance should actually adapt to your business risk profile, not the other way around. Also, another thing, KIS, keep it simple. You want to make sure that your policies are realistic, they're actually actionable, and overcomplicated policies are honestly the fastest way to lose buy-in from your teams. So you want to make sure that you write policies that make sense for your workflow and are easy to follow daily. So less is more. And you want to choose clarity over volume. So you can just ensure that everyone understands and follows more security policies. Also, just another thing that we implemented at our company is that we have our very specific, clear security policies drafted out. But another thing that we added on is that we created security training videos, but we made them a lot more fun. sort of like a TikTok or an Instagram reel style. We've adapted Gen Z TikTok trends, like videos format wise, and we've created our own security training style videos like phishing or like what donutting is, which is like making sure you always lock your screen if you're always on your laptop, just so no information is being spread out in public, or like shoulder surfing, just like basic security trainings. We made them more fun and more approachable. And I would say that that has created more of like an engagement from our coworkers or people who are from our company, like watching these videos. Also, another thing, another like one last final takeaway is that you want to sort of partner with like niche experts for realistic guidance. And so when you're looking at auditors or even like pen testers, it might be tempting to go for like big name providers. But honestly, the smaller ones might be more effective. Like choosing a security partner who actually understands your industry's unique security needs will go a long way. They'll give you more focused attention and tailored recommendations that are necessary to pass your SOC 2 audit smoothly without wasting any resources, time, energy, and efforts. And I think at the end of the day, SOC 2 can feel overwhelming, right? It seems like a long list of checkboxes that you have to do. But I think if you approach it like a marathon, approach it strategically, it'll actually allow you to build customer trust and a very, very, very strong security foundation without getting lost in the weeds.
Lovely. If I had to sum that all up, I would probably use the word refreshing. It's been such a pleasure to listen and have this conversation with you today. And anyone that's stayed with us and listened through this podcast, there you have it. It's not something to be scared of. It's not something you need to worry about. It's valuable. It should be continuous. Thank you, Charissa. It like I said, it really is refreshing to listen to such a modern, lively, energy-filled take on something that a lot of people look at and resent compliance. And if you are, I mean, maybe that key takeaway is, well, you're potentially looking at it wrong. There's ways to make it valuable and to get so much more from it. So from myself, thank you. It's been an absolute blast to have you on the podcast with us today. For everyone listening, thank you for taking the time to join us. Always keen to hear your feedback and comments on it. Charissa, thank you. What a blast.
Thank you so much for having me, Kyle. It was so much fun and an honor to honestly talk to you here today. Thank you again.
Appreciate that, Charissa. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.